Story number 1. The Uninvited Passenger. Winter in Japan is a serene yet unforgiving season. The snow blankets the landscape in pristine white, muting the usual cacophony of city life into a hushed whisper. As a taxi driver in Sapporo, I've grown accustomed to these quiet nights, navigating the empty streets with a sense of calm that only solitude can bring. But on one particularly cold December night in 2016, a simple fare turned into an encounter that would haunt me for years to come. It was around 11:45 p.m. when I received a call for a late-night pickup. The passenger requested a ride from a deserted stretch of Highway 5, a route known for its scenic views but equally infamous for its isolation during the winter months. The snow had been falling steadily all evening, transforming the highway into a slippery, treacherous path. I arrived at the designated spot, the headlights of my Toyota Crown cutting through the thick snowfall. There, standing alone by the roadside, was a man shrouded in darkness. His presence was unsettling. Even in the stillness of the night, he wore a long, black coat that billowed slightly in the cold wind, and his face was entirely obscured by a thick scarf, leaving only his piercing eyes visible beneath the brim of a wide hat. "Need a ride?" I called out, trying to mask the unease creeping up my spine. The man nodded silently, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He climbed into the back seat without a word, the door sliding shut with a definitive click that seemed to echo in the empty cab. I glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of his hollow eyes staring back at me. There was something hauntingly familiar about them, a depth that suggested a story of sorrow and loss. As we began our journey, the silence inside the taxi was thick and suffocating. The only sounds were the steady hum of the engine and the crunch of snow under my tires. I tried to engage him in conversation, asking where he was headed, but he remained mute, his gaze fixed on the window as if searching for something in the endless white. After a few miles, I decided to make a brief stop at a small roadside rest area. The place was almost deserted, the only sign of life a flickering neon sign and a single, dimly lit vending machine. I pulled over, intending to offer him a chance to stretch his legs or grab a hot drink. "Would you like to get out and stretch a bit?" I asked, unlocking the back door. He didn't respond. Instead, he remained seated, his eyes never leaving mine. I hesitated for a moment before reaching over to close the door, but as my hand touched the handle, a chill ran down my spine. The door shut firmly, locking with a sound that reverberated through the cabin. I checked the lock, ensuring it was secure, but the feeling of being trapped only intensified. "Are you sure you want to stay in?" I asked, my voice wavering slightly. Again, no response. I glanced back at him, trying to read any hint of emotion or intent in his eyes, but they remained impassive, almost empty. The rest area felt colder, the air thick with an unspoken tension that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. As we resumed our drive, the highway seemed to stretch on endlessly, the storm intensifying with each passing mile. The man remained silent, his presence a constant, oppressive weight in the back seat. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that I was being watched by more than just a solitary passenger. Minutes turned into hours as we navigated the snow-covered roads, the landscape outside becoming a blur of white and shadow. I tried to focus on the road, but my mind kept drifting back to the man's empty stare and the eerie silence that filled the cabin. The temperature inside the taxi felt unnaturally cold, as if the winter's chill had seeped into the very core of the vehicle. Then, without warning, the man began to speak. His voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight of sadness that resonated deep within me. "Thank you for stopping," he said, his tone tinged with sorrow. I was taken aback by the sudden change, momentarily forgetting his silent demeanor. "You're welcome. Are you feeling all right?" He hesitated before replying, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I've been lost for so long, unable to find my way back." A shiver ran down my spine as I realized the depth of his pain. "Do you need help finding your way?" He looked out the window, his gaze distant. I've tried everything, but I can't move on. My accident left me trapped between worlds, unable to find peace. The revelation hit me hard, the story unfolding like a tragic novel. I'm sorry to hear that. Is there anything I can do? He shook his head slowly. No, but maybe by sharing my story, others can remember and help me find peace. As the dawn began to break, the storm finally subsided, leaving behind a serene blanket of snow that glistened under the morning sun. We reached the next town, the streets coming alive with the hustle and bustle of daybreak. I felt a sense of relief wash over me, the oppressive weight in the cabin lifting as we approached civilization. The man remained silent, his eyes now filled with a quiet acceptance. I pulled over at a bustling gas station. The contrast between the deserted rest area and the lively town stark and surreal. We've arrived, I said, unlocking the back door. He stood up, his form seeming to shimmer in the morning light. Thank you, he whispered, a faint smile playing on his lips. Now I can finally rest. Before I could respond, he stepped out of the taxi, the snowflakes catching in his hair as he walked towards the center of the gas station. I watched in awe as his figure began to fade, dissolving into the crisp morning air until there was nothing left but the lingering scent of his sorrow. I stood there for a moment, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. The rest of the day passed without incident, but the memory of that night remained etched in my mind. I often found myself glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him there again. A silent reminder of the night I encountered a soul lost to tragedy. Years later, the story of the uninvited passenger became a local legend among taxi drivers and truckers. They spoke of a man who had perished in a tragic accident on that very stretch of highway, his spirit forever wandering the snowy roads in search of peace. Some claimed to have seen him, others heard his sorrowful whispers in the dead of night. But all agreed that encountering him was a harrowing experience that left a lasting impression. I never drove that route again. The memory of his hollow eyes and the weight of his sorrow a constant reminder of the thin veil between our world and the next. The encounter taught me to respect the stories of the past, to honor the souls that linger in forgotten places, and to recognize that some passengers are meant to ride the highways alone, their journeys unfinished and their spirits restless. If you ever find yourself driving through the quiet, snow-covered roads of Alaska during the dead of winter, and you see a solitary figure in a long coat standing by the roadside, heed my warning. Don't stop, don't look back, because some souls aren't ready to let go, and some roads are paved with the echoes of their untold stories, waiting to claim the next unsuspecting driver. Remember my story, and let it serve as a cautionary tale. The roads we travel hold more than just our journeys. They hold the lingering spirits of those who came before us, their presence a haunting testament to the fragility of life and the enduring grip of the past. Story number 2. The Vanishing Hauler. Driving through the snow-covered expanses of New York's interstate highways has always been a test of endurance and mental fortitude. As a long-haul trucker, my life revolves around the endless road, the hum of the engine, and the isolation that comes with traversing miles of desolate winter landscapes. In January 2016, I embarked on what was supposed to be a routine delivery from Buffalo to Albany, navigating through a particularly harsh winter storm that had blanketed the state in a thick layer of snow. The night was unforgiving. The wind howled mercilessly, and the windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the relentless barrage of snowflakes. My truck, a dependable Kenworth, was my sanctuary amidst the chaos, its heater battling the sub-zero temperatures to keep me warm. The radio played softly in the background, a mix of classic rock and the occasional weather update that did little to alleviate the tension building inside me. As I approached a long stretch of highway that cut through the heart of the Adirondacks, I noticed a large, imposing truck ahead of me. It was an old freightliner, its paint faded and chipped from years of battling the elements. The truck was moving steadily, its headlights piercing the darkness like twin beacons. At first, I thought it was another trucker making the same arduous journey, but there was something unnerving about its presence. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and to my surprise, the Freightliner was following me. Its driver maintained a constant distance, never overtaking, never slowing down. My heart began to race as I tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe the driver was struggling with the storm, trying to keep up, determined not to let fear take over. I pressed down on the accelerator, hoping to lose the trailing truck. But the Freightliner didn't budge. It matched my speed effortlessly, its engine roaring in harmony with mine. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. The storm was relentless, and visibility was near zero. The road ahead was a blur of white, the trees lining the highway mere shadows in the distance. Minutes turned into what felt like hours as the Freightliner continued its silent pursuit. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Every time I glanced in the mirror, the truck remained steadfast behind me, its presence growing more oppressive with each passing mile. The radio crackled intermittently, occasionally picking up snippets of conversations that seemed out of place amidst the storm. Finally, I decided to take a break at a small, deserted rest stop a few miles ahead. The sign was barely visible through the snowfall, and the few lights that remained flickered sporadically. I pulled into the parking lot, grateful for the chance to stretch my legs and regain my composure. As I stepped out of the truck, the biting cold hit me like a wall, making me shiver involuntarily. I approached the small building, hoping to find a momentary refuge from the storm. The interior was dimly lit, the warmth from a lone heater barely penetrating the chill that clung to the air. There was no one inside, just the echo of my footsteps as I made my way to the window. I looked out, scanning the empty parking lot for any sign of the trailing Freightliner. But it was nowhere to be seen. Puzzled, I returned to my truck, only to find a crumpled receipt on the dashboard. Curious, I unfolded it and saw that it was dated December 15th, 1987, a date that sent a chill down my spine. The receipt detailed a purchase from the very same rest stop, but it was decades old. My mind raced, trying to piece together the inexplicable connection. Determined to find answers, I reached for my phone to call the rest stop's management, but it was dead. No signal in this remote part of the highway. Frustration mounted as I tried to rationalize the situation. Perhaps it was a faulty receipt printer, or maybe someone had mistakenly left it behind. But deep down, I knew something was amiss. As I pondered the mystery, the storm began to intensify, the snow swirling violently around me. The rest stop felt increasingly deserted, the silence almost deafening. I decided to leave, hoping that the answer to my unsettling experience would reveal itself in the quiet of the road ahead. Driving away, the road seemed narrower, the snow piling up higher with each passing mile. The Freightliner was still following me, its presence a constant reminder of the inexplicable events of the night. I felt a growing sense of dread, the isolation amplifying every sound and shadow. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the Freightliner vanished. One moment it was there, its headlights cutting through the darkness, and the next, it was gone, swallowed by the storm and the endless whiteness of the snow-covered highway. I sighed in relief, the tension easing from my shoulders as I continued my journey. But the relief was short-lived. As I rounded a bend, I noticed the remnants of an old, charred wreck on the side of the road. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized the Freightliner, now a mangled heap of twisted metal and smoldering remains. The realization hit me hard. The truck that had been following me was the very same one involved in a fatal accident years ago, its driver never surviving the crash. Panic surged through me as I grappled with the horrifying truth. Was I being haunted by the ghost of the truck's driver? Had his spirit been seeking someone to accompany him in death, perpetuating a loop of his tragic end? The questions swirled in my mind, each one more terrifying than the last. I sped up, desperate to put distance between myself and the site of the accident. The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, the storm still raging with no sign of abating. The memory of the trailing freightliner lingered, a spectral presence that refused to let me forget the night's events. As dawn broke, the storm finally began to subside, the sky lightening with the first hints of morning. Exhausted and shaken, I reached my destination, the haunted highway a distant memory behind me. But the experience left an indelible mark on my psyche, a constant reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the echoes of the storm and the ghostly freightliner haunting my every thought. I shared my story with fellow truckers, some dismissing it as a figment of my imagination, while others nodded knowingly, sharing their own tales of the supernatural that plagued the highways. The legend of the vanishing hauler grew, a ghostly warning to those who dared to traverse the desolate roads of New York's winter highways. It served as a chilling reminder that some spirits are restless, forever bound to the places of their tragic demise, seeking solace or vengeance from beyond the grave. To this day, I avoid that stretch of highway whenever possible. The memory of the ghostly freightliner, a stark reminder of the night when time stood still and the past reached out to claim me as its own. If you ever find yourself driving alone on a desolate highway during a storm, and you see a large truck trailing you relentlessly, remember my story. Don't engage, don't look back, and most importantly, don't let fear overtake your judgment, because some ghosts aren't ready to let go, and some roads are paved with the echoes of the past, waiting to ensnare the next unsuspecting traveler. Story number 3. Whispers in the Snow. Driving through the endless expanse of Siberia has always been a test of endurance and solitude for me. In the winter of 1998, I found myself navigating one of the most remote stretches of the Trans-Siberian Highway, hauling supplies from Irkutsk to Norilsk. The road was a lifeline through the frozen wilderness, a ribbon of asphalt snaking through forests of pine and birch, disappearing into the white abyss of snow-covered hills. The first few days were uneventful, just the way I preferred it. The truck, a sturdy Kamaz, was my only companion, its engine humming steadily as I pushed through the biting cold. The nights were long and dark, the sky a blanket of stars shimmering above the silent landscape. But on the 5th night, something happened that shattered the comforting silence of the Siberian winter. It was well past midnight when I first heard it, a faint, heart-wrenching cry echoing through the cabin. At first, I dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on my ears or perhaps the result of prolonged isolation. But the sound persisted, growing slightly louder, more insistent, as if someone was desperately trying to get my attention. I pulled the truck to a halt on the shoulder, the engine idling as I reached for my flashlight. The cry had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed down on me like a physical weight. Stepping out into the frigid night, I scanned the surroundings, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The snowflakes swirled around me, muffling any sounds from the depths of the forest. There, on the edge of the road, I noticed it, a series of small footprints leading away from the highway and disappearing into the shadows of the dense woodland. They were unmistakably those of children, tiny and delicate, pressed deeply into the fresh snow. My heart pounded in my chest as I followed the trail, the flashlight guiding my way through the thickening snow. The footprints led me deeper into the forest, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels guarding their secrets. The crying had returned, now accompanied by soft whispers that seemed to come from all around me, intertwining with the howling wind. I called out, my voice trembling. "Hello? Is someone there?" No response, just the relentless storm and the echoing cries that tugged at my sanity. I pressed on, driven by a mix of fear and an inexplicable urge to uncover the source of the sorrowful sounds. The forest seemed to close in around me, the darkness thick and impenetrable, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. After what felt like hours, the footprints abruptly stopped at a clearing surrounded by towering fir trees. In the center stood an old, abandoned cabin, its windows shattered and door hanging ajar. The crying was louder here, more desperate, as if the very walls of the building were mourning. I approached cautiously, my breath visible in the icy air, and pushed the door open. Inside, the cabin was a time capsule of a bygone era, dust-covered furniture, remnants of a once cozy fireplace, and old photographs scattered across the floor. The cries seemed to emanate from the back room, so I moved toward it, the flashlight casting long shadows that danced eerily on the walls. As I entered the back room, the cries ceased abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, revealing nothing but empty space and the cold, hard floor. I turned to leave, but a sudden chill swept through the room, and the door slammed shut behind me. Panic surged through me as I fumbled with the handle, but it was locked tight. The whispers returned, swirling around me like a ghostly chorus. "Help us! Help us!" they pleaded, their voices layered and indistinct. My heart raced as I realized that I wasn't alone. Something was here, something that yearned for release. I stumbled back, the realization dawning on me that the cabin was haunted by the spirits of lost souls, perhaps children who had perished in these unforgiving woods. Desperate to escape, I searched the room for any sign of a way out. My flashlight flickered, casting fleeting glimpses of spectral figures that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The temperature plummeted, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air, as the presence of the unseen entities grew stronger, their sorrow palpable, summoning every ounce of courage. I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but my cries were swallowed by the oppressive silence. The whispers intensified, now clearly forming words that resonated with my deepest fears. "Don't leave us. Stay with us." In a frantic attempt to break free, I kicked at the door, the wood splintering under my force. The door finally gave way, and I tumbled out into the snowy night, gasping for air. The forest was silent once more, the footprints leading away from the cabin now erased by the fresh snow. I didn't waste another second, racing back to my truck and speeding away from the haunted clearing. The rest of the journey was a blur of adrenaline and terror, the memory of the crying children and the spectral whispers etched into my mind. When I finally reached the next town, exhausted and shaken, I shared my story with the locals at a small diner. They listened in hushed tones, some nodding in understanding, others shaking their heads skeptically. An elderly man, his face weathered by years in the harsh Alaskan climate, approached me. "You saw the spirits of the lost children," he said quietly. "Many have lost their way in these woods, never to find peace. The cries are their way of seeking help, but few can bear the truth of what they've endured." His words resonated deeply, reinforcing the reality of my experience. I realized that the cabin was a nexus for restless souls, trapped in a perpetual search for solace that the unforgiving winter could not provide. The spirits of the children, lost and alone, continued to haunt the highway, their cries a tragic reminder of the fragility of life and the lingering pain of loss. From that night on, I avoided that stretch of road, the memory of the haunted cabin, a constant reminder of the unseen forces that linger in the cold, silent wilderness. The story of the crying children became a cautionary tale among fellow truckers, a whispered legend that spoke of the spirits who wander the snowy highways, forever searching for a way back to peace. If you ever find yourself driving through the remote stretches of Siberia in the dead of winter, and you hear the faint sound of crying echoing through your cabin, heed my warning. Stop and investigate, but be prepared to face the sorrowful spirits that seek to reach out from the darkness. Because some roads are more than just paths through the wilderness, they're corridors to the past, where the echoes of lost souls linger, forever waiting to be heard. Story number 4. The Pursuing Shadow. Driving through the snow-laden expanses of Colorado has always been a mix of solitude and serenity for me. As a long-haul trucker, the open highways offer a temporary escape from the chaos of everyday life. A chance to clear my mind amidst the rhythmic hum of the engine and the endless blanket of white that stretches as far as the eye can see. But on that fateful night in January 2012, the road became something far more sinister than a mere path through the wilderness. I had been hauling freight from Denver to Boulder, the journey taking me through some of the most remote stretches of Interstate 70. The weather forecast had predicted a brutal winter storm, but I was seasoned enough to handle the challenges that Colorado's harsh winters throw my way. My rig, a sturdy Freightliner, was my trusted companion, its headlights piercing the darkness as I navigated the winding roads with practiced ease. It was around midnight when I first noticed the flicker of headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I dismissed it as another trucker passing by, perhaps struggling with the same storm. But as the miles ticked by, the headlights remained steadfast, their beam unwaveringly fixed on my cabin. I slowed down, my pulse quickening as I saw the unmistakable outline of an old, rusted sedan inching closer behind me. I glanced again, and the sedan was right there, headlights blinding me through the darkness. My heart pounded as I rolled down my window slightly, the cold night air rushing into the cab. "Need a ride?" I called out, my voice betraying a hint of unease. The car didn't respond. Instead, it mirrored my every move, maintaining a steady distance no matter how much I adjusted my speed. It was as if the vehicle had a mind of its own, a ghostly presence determined to follow me through the storm. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but the sedan remained relentless, its presence growing more ominous with each passing mile. The road ahead was treacherous, the snow swirling in blinding sheets that made visibility nearly impossible. My hands tightened around the steering wheel, knuckles whitening as I fought to maintain control. Hours passed, and the storm showed no signs of abating. The headlights of the sedan continued to haunt me, their eerie glow casting long shadows across the windshield. Every time I glanced in the mirror, there it was, an unyielding reminder that I wasn't alone on this desolate stretch of road. Desperation set in as I realized the sedan wasn't just another trucker. It was something else, something that didn't belong in the realm of the living. The radio had long since lost signal, the only sound now the howling wind and the persistent hum of my engine. I considered pulling over, seeking refuge at the next rest stop. But my instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong. Just as I mustered the courage to make a turn, the sedan made its move. Without warning, it accelerated, matching my speed and positioning itself directly behind me. Panic surged through me as I tried to speed up, but the storm seemed to conspire against me. The road slick and treacherous beneath my tires. The sedan mirrored my every maneuver, inching closer until its headlights were almost upon me. In a frantic bid to lose it, I veered sharply onto a side road blanketed in deeper snow. The tires struggled for traction, the truck skidding dangerously as I tried to regain control. The sedan followed suit, its movements synchronized with mine, as if driven by the same unseen force that compelled it to pursue me relentlessly. Then, just as abruptly as it had appeared, the sedan vanished. One moment it was right there, and the next, it was gone, swallowed by the storm and the endless whiteness. I sat there, heart racing, breathing heavily as the silence settled over me once more. The storm had not relented, but the threat had dissipated, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and the lingering fear that something evil had been chasing me through the night. The next morning, battered by exhaustion and the aftermath of the storm, I decided to seek answers. I stopped at a small town a few miles ahead, the remnants of the storm evident in the fallen branches and the heavy snow covering everything. At a rundown diner, I shared my story with an elderly man nursing a cup of coffee at the counter. He listened intently, his expression somber. "You're talking about the Phantom sedan," he said quietly. "That car has been seen on these roads for years, especially during heavy storms. They say it belongs to a man named Jack Miller who died in a horrific accident here back in 2012. His rig lost control in the blizzard, and he never made it out. Some folks believe his spirit can't move on, forever reliving his final drive. I felt a chill despite the warm coffee in my hands. So, the sedan was his spirit? The man nodded slowly. Yes, or so the legend goes. It's said that Jack Miller's ghost drives these roads during storms, searching for help or perhaps seeking revenge on those who forget the dangers of these treacherous paths. Many who've encountered the phantom sedan say it's a harbinger of doom, a warning to heed the storm and respect the road. The weight of his words settled heavily on me. I realized then that my encounter was more than just a freak occurrence. It was a brush with the restless spirit of a man who had lost his life to the very roads I had navigated for so long. The fear and unease I felt were now rooted in a tragic story of loss and lingering sorrow. As I left the diner, the sun had begun to rise, casting a pale light over the snowy landscape. The memory of the phantom sedan haunted me, a ghostly reminder of the fragility of life and the dangers that lurk in the most desolate places. I vowed never to take those remote stretches of highway lightly again, respecting the power of nature and the spirits that may roam the roads I traveled. Years have passed since that harrowing night, but the memory remains vivid in my mind. I've shared my story with fellow truckers, each one nodding in understanding, some sharing their own encounters with the phantom sedan. It serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder that some roads are more than just paths. They're conduits for the restless souls who wander them, forever searching for peace they can't find. If you ever find yourself driving through the remote highways of Colorado during a storm, and you see an old, rusted sedan tailing you with its headlights fixed on your cabin, remember my story. Don't engage, don't look back, and don't let fear overtake your judgment. Respect the road, heed the warnings, and know that some spirits aren't ready to let go, forever bound to the highways they once traveled in life. Because on those desolate stretches, under the cloak of a relentless storm, the past can catch up with you, driving you into a nightmarish journey from which there's no escape. Story number 5. The Woman Who Waved. Driving through the Alaskan wilderness has always been a test of endurance and patience. The vast, snow-covered expanses stretch endlessly before me, broken only by the occasional cluster of towering pines or the distant silhouette of a mountain range. In the winter of 2005, I found myself navigating one of Alaska's most secluded highways, hauling supplies from Fairbanks to a remote logging camp nestled deep within the forest. The road was familiar yet unforgiving, winding through barren landscapes where the silence was so complete it felt almost tangible. My rig, a reliable freightliner, hummed steadily beneath me, its headlights piercing the thick blanket of snow that clung to the asphalt. It was just past midnight when I first noticed her, a solitary figure standing by the roadside, her long coat billowing gently in the frigid wind. At first, I thought she might be stranded, a traveler caught in the storm, seeking shelter or assistance. I slowed down, the tires crunching softly against the icy surface, and rolled down the window. "Need some help?" I called out, my breath visible in the cold air. She stood there silently, her gaze fixed on my truck. There was something hauntingly beautiful about her, an ethereal presence that seemed out of place in the harsh Alaskan night. Without a word, she stepped forward, her movements graceful and deliberate, and climbed into the back seat. I glanced back, expecting to see her settling in, but to my surprise, the seat remained empty. "Did you see that?" I asked, confused, as the truck continued its journey through the storm. The road ahead was obscured by swirling snow, making it difficult to see more than a few feet in front of me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The cabin remained silent, the only sounds the steady hum of the engine and the occasional howl of the wind outside. As I approached a secluded rest stop, a small, dilapidated building barely visible through the blizzard, I decided it was time to take a break. Pulling into the parking area, I stepped out of the truck, the cold biting at my skin. The rest stop was abandoned, the lights flickering weakly above the entrance, casting eerie shadows across the snow-covered ground. I walked around the truck, searching for any sign of the woman who had briefly occupied the back seat. There was nothing, no footprints, no personal belongings, nothing to indicate she had been there. The back door of the truck was locked, just as I had left it, and the interior remained undisturbed. Puzzled and unnerved, I climbed back into the cab, trying to dismiss the strange occurrence as a trick of the light or perhaps a hallucination brought on by the isolation and the relentless storm. But the memory of her silent gaze lingered, a ghostly imprint on my mind. As I prepared to leave the rest stop, I decided to visit a nearby town to gather my thoughts and possibly find some answers. The next morning, over a hot cup of coffee at a small diner, I struck up a conversation with an older man sitting alone at the counter. His weathered face and tired eyes suggested he had seen many winters pass in this desolate region. "Excuse me," I began hesitantly. "Did you ever hear about a woman who died in a car accident on this road a few years back?" He looked up, his expression shifting from curiosity to sorrow. "Yes, I remember her," he said quietly. "Eleanor Hart. She was a young mother, lost in the storm just like today. Her truck veered off the road, and she didn't make it." I felt a chill run down my spine. "I think I saw her last night," I confessed, recounting the brief encounter. The man nodded solemnly. "People say her spirit still wanders these roads, searching for her way back. Some folks have reported seeing her, especially during heavy storms. They believe she never found peace, stuck between the world of the living and the dead." His words hung heavily in the air, a haunting confirmation of what I had experienced. I thanked him and left the diner, the story of Eleanor Hart now etched into my memory. That night, as I drove back through the same desolate highway, the snowstorm had lessened but the road remained treacherous. The memory of Eleanor's tragic end weighed heavily on me, making the darkness feel even more oppressive. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing by the roadside once more. As the hours passed, fatigue began to set in, my eyelids growing heavy despite the cold that kept me alert. It was around 3 a.m. when I first noticed the faint sound of laughter, soft, childlike giggles that seemed to echo through the cabin. My heart raced as I tried to locate the source, but the road remained empty, the snow-covered landscape offering no clues. The laughter continued, growing louder and more insistent, mingling with the howling wind outside. I reached for the dashboard clock, only to find it stopped at 3 o'clock. Confusion and fear gripped me as I realized that time itself seemed to have paused, leaving me trapped in a moment that refused to move forward. Panic surged through me as the laughter reached a crescendo, the sound now intertwined with whispers that seemed to emanate from all around. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there she was again, Eleanor Hart, standing by the roadside, her eyes hollow and searching. This time, she wasn't alone. Behind her, the shadowy outline of a truck loomed, its headlights dim and ghostly in the night. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm's remnants. "Help me find my way." Without thinking, I rolled down the window, my voice trembling. "Eleanor, I'm so sorry. I didn't know." Her figure began to fade, the edges of her form dissolving into the darkness. The shadow truck followed suit, vanishing without a trace as quickly as it had appeared. The laughter and whispers ceased abruptly, leaving me in a profound silence that pressed down on me like a physical weight. The dashboard clock began to tick again, the seconds moving forward as if waking from a long slumber. I sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened, before pulling into the next available rest stop. The warmth of the building welcomed me, a stark contrast to the cold horror I had left behind. The experience left me shaken, a stark reminder of the thin veil between our world and the unknown. I never spoke of that night to anyone, choosing instead to keep the memory locked away, a haunting presence that lingered in the depths of my mind. The story of Eleanor Hart became a cautionary tale among fellow truckers, a whispered legend that spoke of lost souls wandering the snowy highways, forever searching for peace that eludes them. Years later, I still think about that encounter whenever I drive through those isolated stretches of road. The image of Eleanor's hollow eyes and the sound of her desperate whispers remain vivid, a chilling reminder that some spirits are trapped in a loop of their own tragedy, waiting for someone to help them find their way back to the light. If you ever find yourself driving alone on a desolate highway in Alaska during a storm, and you see a woman in a long coat waving at your truck, heed my warning. Don't stop. Don't look back. Because some souls aren't ready to let go. And some roads are paved with the echoes of their unfinished stories, waiting to claim the next lost traveler. Remember my story, and let it serve as a reminder that the roads we travel hold more than just our journeys. They hold the lingering spirits of those who came before us. Their presence a haunting testament to the fragility of life and the enduring grip of the past. Story number 6. Footprints into the woods. Driving through the serene expanse of Vermont in winter has always been a source of solace for me and my friends. The winding highways, blanketed in pristine snow, offer a peaceful escape from the chaos of everyday life. In February 2005, my friends and I, Sarah, Mike, and Jenna, decided to embark on a long-distance road trip, eager to experience the untouched beauty of the Appalachian Mountains. The journey began without a hitch. We loaded up my trusty SUV with camping gear, warm clothes, and enough supplies to last us a week. The first few days were filled with laughter, scenic drives, and the occasional hike through snow-covered trails. Vermont's winter landscape was breathtaking, each turn revealing a new vista of icy peaks and frost-laden trees. On the fourth day, as we navigated a particularly remote stretch of highway, a sudden snowstorm rolled in. The sky darkened ominously, and visibility dropped to mere feet. Determined to push through, we pressed on, the SUV's headlights barely cutting through the blinding whiteout. The road seemed endless, stretching into the abyss of snow and darkness. After hours of relentless driving, we decided to take a break. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and fatigue was setting in. We found a small, deserted rest area, a relic from a bygone era with a single, dilapidated restroom and an old vending machine that hummed quietly in the stillness. Relieved to find shelter, we parked the SUV and huddled together for warmth. As we stepped outside, the world was a monochrome canvas of swirling snow and biting cold. Mike suggested we take a short walk to stretch our legs, and the others agreed, albeit hesitantly. Bundled up in our heavy jackets and gloves, we ventured into the storm, the snow crunching beneath our boots. As we walked along the deserted highway, the only sounds were the howling wind and the occasional creak of the trees swaying under the weight of the snow. Suddenly, Sarah stopped, pointing to the ground. There, etched into the fresh snow, were a series of footprints leading off the road and into the dense forest beyond. The prints were large and deep, suggesting they belonged to a person. But there was something unsettling about them. They abruptly stopped in the middle of the woods, as if the walker had vanished into thin air. "Do you guys see this?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. Mike knelt down to examine the footprints more closely. "Yeah, but it's weird. They just stop here. There's no way someone just disappeared like that." Jenna shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her. "Maybe someone got lost or fell. It's easy to get disoriented in a snowstorm." I felt a chill run down my spine. Or maybe something happened to them. Let's not linger here any longer. We decided to head back to the SUV, eager to escape the Eerie trail. As we turned to leave, a sense of unease settled over us. The footprints lingered in my mind, a silent question about their sudden end. We trudged back through the storm, the rest area now feeling even more desolate and abandoned. Back in the warmth of the SUV, we tried to shake off the unsettling feeling. Mike suggested we take another short break, but Jenna was insistent that we push through the storm without stopping again. "We need to keep moving. The storm won't wait for us." Reluctantly, we agreed and resumed our journey. The road ahead was treacherous. The snow piled high against the sides of the highway. The headlights of the SUV illuminated nothing but white. The world outside a blinding expanse of snow and ice. Hours passed, and the storm showed no mercy. Just when hope seemed lost, we spotted the faint outline of a cabin in the distance, its windows glowing with a warm, inviting light. Relief washed over us as we approached, the promise of shelter fueling our weary bodies. The cabin was small and rustic, nestled between two towering pine trees that stood like silent guardians against the storm. As we pulled into the driveway, Mike remarked, "This looks like a good place to stay for the night." We entered the cabin, grateful for the warmth and the shelter it provided. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burning wood from the fireplace. The room was sparsely furnished, with a wooden table, a couple of chairs, and a stack of old magazines on a dusty shelf. We set up our sleeping bags and settled in for the night, the storm raging outside now reduced to a steady, muffled roar. As we sat around the fire, sharing stories to pass the time, Sarah suddenly asked, "Did you guys see those footprints outside?" We nodded, the memory of them still vivid in our minds. "Yeah, it's strange," Jenna said. "I wonder who it could have been." Mike, always the practical one, replied, "Probably just someone trying to get out of the storm, maybe a hiker or something." Later that night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, the cabin grew silent except for the crackling of the fire. The wind howled outside, and the snow continued to fall in relentless sheets. I drifted off to sleep, the uneasy feeling from earlier still lingering at the edges of my consciousness. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a faint noise, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the window. My heart raced as I strained to hear over the sound of the storm. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the cabin like a desperate plea. I unzipped my sleeping bag and cautiously approached the window, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the swirling snow outside. Confused, I turned to leave, only to hear a faint whisper behind me. "Help us!" I spun around, the flashlight catching the flicker of movement at the edge of the room. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure cloaked in darkness. Her white coat stood out starkly against the dim interior of the cabin, her face hidden beneath a hood. She stared at us with hollow eyes, her presence sending a chill down my spine. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. She remained silent, her gaze fixed on me. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deepening as the figure moved closer. Panic surged through me as I backed away, reaching for the door. "Guys, wake up!" I shouted, pulling the others out of their sleeping bags. We gathered around the figure, but she began to fade into the darkness, her form dissolving like mist in the morning sun. The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving us in a heavy silence once more. The next morning, the storm had finally passed, leaving behind a pristine blanket of snow. We packed up our belongings, the memory of the night's encounter still fresh in our minds. As we prepared to leave, Sarah pointed to the footprints outside once again. "Look," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They lead into the woods, just like last night." I felt a shiver run down my spine. Maybe we should just get out of here as soon as possible. We drove away from the cabin, the road now clear and the sky a brilliant blue. But the feeling of being watched lingered, a silent presence that seemed to follow us through the snowy landscape. When we reached the next town, we decided to ask a local about the cabin and the footprints. At a small diner, we found an older man sitting alone, sipping his coffee. I approached him cautiously, explaining our experience. He looked up, his eyes dark and knowing. "You're talking about the ghostly footprints," he said slowly. "That cabin has a tragic history. Years ago, a family got lost in the storm and perished in the woods. Their spirits are said to wander these parts, unable to find peace." I felt a chill settle over me. "So the footprints and the figure we saw, are they their ghosts?" He nodded solemnly. "Some say they appear to lost travelers, trying to guide them to safety, while others believe they're seeking company, unable to let go of their past lives." We left the diner in stunned silence. the weight of the man's words pressing down on us. The story matched our experience too closely to be mere coincidence. As we drove away, the footprints leading into the woods became a haunting reminder of the souls trapped in the unforgiving winter wilderness. To this day, I avoid that stretch of highway during the winter months. The memory of that night, a constant reminder of the thin line between the living and the dead. The footprints that lead into the woods are a silent testament to the lives lost to the storm. Their presence a chilling reminder that some paths are better left unexplored. If you ever find yourself driving through the remote areas of Vermont in the dead of winter, and you come across a set of footprints leading into the woods, heed my warning, don't follow them. Some spirits are lost forever, wandering the snowy trails in search of a way back to the life they once knew. And if you see a figure standing by the roadside, cloaked in darkness with hollow eyes, remember the story of that night and keep moving forward, because some ghosts aren't ready to let go, and some roads lead to places where the past refuses to fade. Story number 7. The Vanishing Shadow. Driving through the desolate expanse of the Canadian Rockies has always been a mix of awe and tranquility for me. The endless stretches of snow-covered roads, the towering pines standing sentinel against the biting wind, and the vast, open sky create a sense of solitude that I crave. In the winter of 2012, I decided to embark on a solo trucking job, hauling supplies from Calgary to Vancouver. It was a routine run, one that promised the peaceful isolation I needed after months of hectic city life. The first few days passed without incident. The roads were clear, the weather cooperative, and the scenery breathtaking. I reveled in the silence, the only sounds being the hum of my truck's engine and the occasional howl of a distant wolf. But as I ventured deeper into the Rockies, the landscape began to change. The trees grew denser, the roads narrower, and the weather turned increasingly harsh. By the time I reached a remote stretch of Highway 93, a fierce snowstorm had settled in, reducing visibility to mere feet. I had been driving for hours, the storm showing no signs of abating. My headlights barely penetrated the swirling snow, making every mile feel like a battle against the elements. Fatigue weighed heavily on me, but I pressed on, determined to complete my delivery before the worst of the storm hit. It was around midnight when I first saw him, a solitary figure standing in the middle of the road, clad in a black coat, his head bowed against the wind. At first, I thought he was just another traveler seeking shelter or assistance. I slowed down, the wipers struggling to keep up with the relentless snowfall, and edged my truck closer to him. As I approached, the man's presence became more unsettling. He stood motionless, his back to me, seemingly unaffected by the storm raging around him. I rolled down my window, hoping to offer help. "Need a lift?" I called out, my voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. There was no response, just the sound of the storm and the man's silent vigil. I hesitated, the unease in my gut growing stronger. Deciding it was best to keep moving, I started to drive past him. But as I did, something inexplicable happened. The man vanished into thin air, disappearing before my eyes without a trace. Shaken, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him following me. But the road behind was empty, swallowed by the storm's fury. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to rationalize what I had just witnessed. Ghost stories? A trick of the light? The fatigue of the long drive playing tricks on my mind? Determined to put it behind me, I continued driving. But the memory of the vanishing man lingered, a shadowy presence that refused to fade. The storm showed no mercy, the snow piling up relentlessly as I navigated the treacherous roads. Hours passed, and exhaustion began to take its toll, my eyelids heavy despite the cold that kept me alert. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that I decided to take a break. Spotting a small, deserted gas station illuminated by a single flickering light, I pulled over, grateful for a moment of respite. The building was old, its paint peeling and windows covered in frost. The attendant, a gaunt man with hollow eyes, didn't greet me as I approached. "Fuel, please," I said, trying to mask my unease. He nodded silently, the gears in the pump turning with a haunting creak. As I filled up, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The station felt abandoned, the air thick with an unspoken tension. My gaze wandered to a dusty corner where an old clock hung on the wall, his hands frozen at 3 a.m. "What's wrong with the clock?" I asked, pointing to it. The attendant glanced over, his expression unreadable. "Doesn't matter," he replied curtly. "Time doesn't matter here." I frowned, sensing the cryptic nature of his response. "Why is it stuck at 3 o'clock?" He shrugged, turning back to his work. "Some things are better left unanswered." Before I could press further, a chill wind swept through the station, and the lights flickered ominously. The storm outside intensified, the howling wind now accompanied by the distant sound of what seemed like children's laughter. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I paid for the fuel and hurried back to my truck, eager to leave the unsettling station behind. As I resumed my journey, the storm showed no signs of letting up. The road ahead was barely visible, the snowstorm transforming the landscape into a whiteout of confusion and fear. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man in black reappear. But there was nothing, only the endless expanse of snow and darkness. Suddenly, the truck's engine sputtered and died, the silence deafening. I tried to restart it, but the engine remained stubbornly silent. Panic surged through me as I realized I was stranded in the middle of the storm, miles from the nearest town and without any means of communication. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the biting cold, the wind lashing against my face, and began to inspect the truck. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow, circling around the truck. My heart raced as I shone the flashlight in every direction, but there was no one in sight. The snow remained undisturbed, no footprints leading away from the scene, no sign of anyone nearby. Desperate for answers, I walked to the back of the truck, checking the doors and windows for any signs of tampering. Nothing. The mystery deepened, the fear gnawing at me as the storm continued its relentless assault. The footsteps grew louder, more insistent, but every time I turned to look, there was no one there. I retreated back to the cab, locking the doors behind me, my breaths visible in the freezing air. The atmosphere inside the truck was suffocating, the walls closing in as the footsteps continued to echo around me. I could feel a presence, an unseen force watching and waiting, as if the man in black was determined to make his presence known. Suddenly, the truck's headlights flickered on and off, casting eerie shadows through the windshield. In the brief moments of light, I saw him again, the man in black standing just beyond the reach of the headlights, his head bowed, staring silently at the truck. My heart pounded as I realized that stopping was no longer an option, that I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. The footsteps ceased abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on me like a physical weight. I sat there, paralyzed by fear, until the storm began to subside, the snow slowing to a gentle fall. The cold lessened, and the first hints of dawn began to break over the horizon, casting a pale light on the deserted highway. With trembling hands, I managed to restart the truck's engine, the hum a welcome sound in the newfound quiet. I drove cautiously through the remaining miles of the storm, the memory of the man in black and the haunting footsteps lingering in my mind. When I finally reached the outskirts of a small town, relief washed over me, and I quickly made my way to the nearest gas station to warm up and regain my composure. As I recounted the night's events to a sympathetic attendant, I couldn't help but wonder about the man in black and the eerie phenomena that had unfolded. The locals had little to say, their faces etched with skepticism. But one older man in the back corner seemed to recognize the tale. "You're talking about the Phantom of Dalton Pass," he said quietly, his eyes distant. "A driver lost to the storm last year. They say his spirit still haunts that stretch of road, unable to move on." I felt a chill run down my spine as the truth settled in. The man in black wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was the restless spirit of a driver who had met a tragic end on those very roads. His presence was a warning, a reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead, and the dangers that lurk in the most desolate places. I never returned to that stretch of highway again, the memory of the vanishing man and the inexplicable phenomena serving as a constant reminder of the night's terror. The Rockies, with all their beauty and isolation, held secrets that were better left undisturbed, shadows that watched and waited for those who dared to traverse their lonely roads. If you ever find yourself driving through the Canadian Rockies during a storm, and you see a lone figure standing by the road, heed my warning. Don't stop. Don't look back. Because some spirits aren't ready to let go. And some roads are paved with the echoes of the past, waiting to claim their next unsuspecting traveler. Remember my story, and let it serve as a cautionary tale. The mountains are beautiful, but they also hold the restless souls of those who lost their way, forever wandering the snowy highways in search of peace that eludes them.